All right, so I want to thank everyone for joining us. I know these are very strange circumstances, but we're obviously trying to make the best of it. And I really want to welcome everyone here. I know we have quite a few viewers in Israel and quite a few in the United States as well, maybe some other places. If you're joining us via Zoom or via our Facebook page, where we're being live streamed, then welcome. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully the first of several online panels at the Center for the Study of the United States in partnership with the Fulbright Program is going now to produce and broadcast for your general benefit, and also to try to adjust and transition towards online and make the best of the challenging circumstances brought on by the coronavirus. So again, I want to thank everyone here for joining us. I want to thank our friends at the United States Embassy in Israel, and at the Fulbright Program, and also the center staff and and everyone for helping organize this. In general, what we're going to do now, we're just going to have a nice conversation with our two panelists and a Q&A. I want to invite everyone to send questions. You can do so either through the chat on the Zoom or via Facebook, or even if you're more comfortable, just email us at the US Center at tauex.tau.ac.il, and we'll bring up and read out your question. So we're happy to take that, and let's just get to it. I want to introduce our two wonderful guests, colleagues and friends of mine, Professor Zakim from Tel-Aviv University's History Department, and Dr. Eli Cook from Haifa University's History Department. And I think we have the wonderful privilege of speaking now with, I think, two of the most prominent and certainly knowledgeable historians of the development of capitalism in the United States. And I think their insight and knowledge is certainly applicable and important as we try to understand moving forward what the coronavirus means for the future of American society and specifically American capitalism. So Michael and Eli, welcome and thank you very much for joining us. I want to start off with a question of my own that has to do with the symbolism of politics and economics and the way that they've come together. And the fact that, I think last week, there's something very symbolic about the fact that at this moment of crisis, at the height of the turmoil brought about by the coronavirus, the spiking death tolls, Bernie Sanders, right, the suspends or essentially withdraws from the Democratic primary race. And there's something symbolic. It could be tragic, but it could be good it depends what you think about Bernie, that at this moment, right, when this crisis essentially maybe validated some of his points and certainly his central goal of establishing some kind of universal healthcare in the United States, that at this moment his campaign ends. And I want to build upon that to then ask both Michael and Eli, moving forward, do you see this as a moment of opportunity for establishing maybe a welfare state or the type of America that Bernie Sanders was trying to promote, at least partially, maybe a New Deal, right? That's kind of been discussed, or merely what we're going to see after this crisis is over is business as usual, right? Excuse the pun, which means neoliberalism emerges out of this even stronger, right? Where is America heading? Michael, I want to start with you, please.
Well, you want to start with me? That's a big question. So my answers are no, yes, yes, but no. It's a business as usual. That's an interesting, let's start with business as usual. Is there really such a condition in a dynamic capitalist economy or capitalist society, which is characterized perhaps more by anything else by its tendency to generate crises. So in that respect, perhaps there is no business as usual. Sanders was defeated already 2 months ago, right? If I'm not mistaken, the results in the elections in conservative states in the South, particularly. I can only presume that the establishment within the Democratic Party, those who worked so hard to nominate Hillary Clinton 3-4 years ago, it did the same for Biden this time around. But what's I think very important for Sanders to do is what he's doing, and that is not offer at this point at least, any kind of support or endorsement for Biden, but begin the negotiation with Biden over Biden's candidacy, but more importantly over his presidency, and more importantly perhaps over the shape of the Democratic Party and what its policies will be. So, because in the United States, the electoral system is designed to give winner takes all, even to those who win just 51% of the votes. In other words, you can win 49% of the votes and have no representation whatsoever in the houses of Congress or the White House. So the coalition negotiations take place before the elections, rather than here in Israel after the election. So the negotiations are now beginning, and I can only hope that Bernie Sanders insists on control of the important economic posts within a Biden cabinet, and of course the vice presidential, because Biden himself strikes me as a pretty disastrous candidate in terms of
all things being relative.
Any hope for change. Yeah.
Okay. Eli, you want to address that question, or?
Sorry, I was breaking up for a second. Can you repeat that? What was that you said? The last.
Do you want to address maybe the broader question of where do we go now? Do we go right? Do we go left? Or please.
Yeah, so I think that's a question that definitely is on a lot of people's mind now. What is the coronavirus going to kind of do to the state of American capitalism? And I think there are basically two ways to look at one is in the short term, and the other is more the long term changes. I can imagine a situation where in the short term things will kind of be business as usual. Michael is right to say that what is business as usual in the capitalist society, but I would say business as usual in this sense would mean, very high levels of inequality, a state that has seen already is more interested in many ways in making sure that they prop up the stock market than make sure that, people are surviving this crisis in the best way possible. Certainly, I don't see any major political change happening anytime soon. Like you mentioned, there was kind of like this interesting timing with this virus occurring really just days after Bernie Sanders was effectively defeated in the Super Tuesday contest. So in that sense, I definitely am not optimistic in changes quickly. I do have to say, though, that when I look at the long run, I think that things are going to change in the United States. And I think when you see the numbers of, this isn't even including this week's numbers, 10 million Americans in the first 2 weeks of the crisis lost their jobs. And out of those, 3.5 million lost health. I do wonder if, the real basic core kind of tendency in American society since the mid-20th century, which is essentially welfare capitalism, which means you can receive certain benefits, but only through your employer. Is that going to survive these huge numbers of mass employment? Or in the end, are we going to see a situation where, Bernie Sanders loses the presidency, but his Medicare for all idea kind of lives on? And here I think it's also important to say that I think the fact that we're having high levels of unemployment is an interesting political moment, because I think what neoliberalism has been very good at doing is keeping people very busy so they don't really have time to protest or really, go out to the streets and demand major structural and political changes. People work almost the most hours of any other country in the world. In the United States, oftentimes they need to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. I mean, they're just exhausted. They do not have time to begin to kind of, politically mobilize. Unemployment, on the other hand, is a different situation. It's a different condition. It's a far more dangerous condition as far as creating stability within capitalist systems. And I think throughout history, we've seen that oftentimes changes have come in moments of high employment. And so therefore, I do think that if we kind of stabilize the corona situation, which allows people to leave the house, but we don't see, millions of people going back to their jobs, and I do not think it's a given that everyone's just going to get the job back that they got before, then I think things do get interesting. And if you have, double-digit unemployment and maybe even higher, then I do think that we could be looking at a situation which is in some ways similar to the 30s, where there is a crisis that goes beyond just your usual economic depression, and we see kind of like a mass grassroots movement that can demand things. And just one more thing about that, I think there was about a week or two in February where people could really imagine, especially elites and the 1%, but also kind of like the Democratic establishment. I think people for a moment really could imagine a world where Bernie Sanders was going to be president. They could feel it, and they were very scared. And I think that fear.
Is it possible that you could only imagine it on the internet or in a certain, maybe isolated, insular part of the society, and it didn't really trickle down to anything that resembles a majority? Maybe that was kind of the echo chamber, or some of us also, myself included, being maybe self-delusional?
I totally agree with what you're saying with the echo chamber, but nevertheless, before Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropped out, everyone was talking about the fact that Sanders was the front runner, and people were terrified of this. Chris Matthews on CNBC comparing it to Germany in the 1930s, Biden and the Democratic Party, going nuts and freaking out. And so I think that fear is very important, because I think throughout American history, we've seen that if the left can be seen as a viable threat, then you can see real reform happen. Because then you'll get the kind of corporate liberalism that we've seen before. We'll give them Medicare for all because we're worried, about a revolution. So right. I do think in that sense, just the fact that Sanders got this far could have important ramifications in the long term.
All right. I want to get back to Michael, your pessimism, right? What might be the implications if in this moment of crisis, and it's right, undoubtedly, in terms of economics and American society, this is an unprecedented moment of crisis that I think the analogy is much more closer to 1929 than it is to 2008, right? That's also one of the big arguments. But if it is 1929 levels, and just looking at the unemployment rate spike every week, it actually seems like it's going that way, where you have entire sectors of the economy just shutting down overnight, right? Tourism, hospitality, airlines. I mean, these are tens of millions of Americans are employed, and the people who support them, right? So if even in this unprecedented moment of crisis, America does not embrace some of the Bernie Sanders ideology, some of the left-wing policies, whatever, universal health care or regulating Wall Street, or employing much harsher taxes and regulations on corporations, what does that tell us about, I don't know, about the future of the American left? About the possibilities for progressive politics?
Yeah, first of all, I'm very glad that our conversation's already begun to define or recognize that the crisis, of course, is in mass unemployment, or what could otherwise be characterized as a wholesale destruction of the economy, and at the same time, by the way, a subversion of civil society, not just in the United States, but in countries all over the world. That's the crisis. That's the emergency. That's the catastrophe. They have nothing, I would suggest, nothing to do with the disease itself. I don't quite understand why the capitalist state in the United States today, for instance, and perhaps we might want to expand our discussion and try to understand why exactly capital and the state have now pursued this rather, how did you characterize it, as a rather unprecedented policy of destruction. I've got a few theories, although I have to confess, more and more of them verge or find me reverting to all sorts of categories and concepts of mass psychosis, right? These are, by the way, these were the kinds of explanations that began to circulate in the 1930s and the 1940s for what the world experienced, the rise of fascism. Elias Canetti and Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, and Erich Fromm, a reality that was increasingly being governed by our own unconscious or subconscious fears. And in that respect, the analogy is a true one, because we're witness today, of course, to the resurgence of fascism throughout the industrial West, as in the 30s. And in that respect, it might be appropriate to try to grasp the meaning and the significance, the influence and the power of our mass unconscious. I found myself the past few days reading Kafka. No one else has been very helpful, at least for me, in making sense of these dynamics that don't strike me as dynamics that are difficult to unpackage in kind of the rational terms that we're used to thinking about political and economic crises. For instance, 2008, it was clear what happened. Now it's not clear at all. However, the analogy to the 1930s that both you and Eli suggested, I think, is limited. And in fact, it might not be relevant at all. Mass unemployment did serve it did become a very important political motivator in the 1930s. But that was first and foremost because millions and millions of Americans were members of trade unions and labor unions and political parties. For instance, even a Communist Party of America that was organized around the workplace. So there was a corporate identity and a corporate form of politics that allowed the masses, the unemployed masses or the underemployed masses, the impoverished masses, to organize and cooperate in ways that, however, that did not lead to a solution to the economic crisis. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. The success of the New Deal came after the war, when it was called the Fair Deal, or there was a universal employment and then civil rights movement. But by then, after the war and the defeat of fascism, the right wing was too embarrassed to continue what they did in the 30s, which was to successfully stymie attempts by the Roosevelt administration, of course, the first administration, in what were not terribly radical steps to organize the economy, to allow the state an active role in organizing the economy. The Supreme Court disallowed the policies that Roosevelt sought to promote. That's led to his aborted attempt to pack the court. And by the way, today I think we have the most reactionary Supreme Court since the court of the 30s. So I don't see too much hope here in terms of any far-reaching post-capitalist forms of reorganization of property and the ownership of property and the distribution of property in the United States. And even when the economy turned down again in 37, there was another crisis in 37, and then there was more radical talk within the administration. That's Roosevelt's second administration, as in terms of a more aggressive, centralized set of steps to take. And that's when they began also to think about packing the Supreme Court. Ultimately, it was those steps were largely frustrated within the administration, but then the war broke out. And the war, of course, ended the Depression, as we all know. And then after the war, a New Deal regime was put into place, or an American welfare state. So, Eli, I don't share your optimism in terms of looking for parallels to what had been left liberal success in a previous crisis. I don't see this crisis being at all like those. And because we have 2, 3, 4 decades, at least since Reagan, of course, of a breathtaking neoliberal success in as you did point out, keeping people from effectively pursuing any kind of radical form of politics. So
I wanted to pose the question, right? If, and I think you're suggesting, Michael, because it's obviously it's not simply that there's structural forces working against any progressive change, but also the fact, obviously, the structural changes in the economy since the 70s, certainly the shift towards a service-based economy and the gig economy, and right, it's much harder to mobilize workers. Certainly, there's basically labor unions are very marginal. Certainly, nothing like they were in the 30s and the 40s. But then the question is there no hope moving forward in terms of progressive politics, or does that require progressive politics a significant shift, right, in how they organize and in the type of message and in the type of recruitment and in their appeal to the wider public? And Eli, I think maybe then I want to raise the question with you in terms of why are you optimistic then?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, that there's a lot of interesting things that I think are happening right now as far as the economy goes that in the long run make me kind of curious as to where's the end game here for neoliberalism. One of them is the fact that neoliberalism's solution to economic crises is monetary policy. We're just going to lower interest rates and print a ton of money, but we're not going to, of course, print that money and give it to the government in fiscal thing. We're going to print that money and we're going to give it to the banks. And then the banks hopefully are going to get us out of this mess through basically the workings of the free market. And I think that that gun and that bazooka, as they sometimes call it, I mean, it's shooting its last rounds as we speak. The Federal Reserve, as we see it now, is really insane things to try to prop up market. They're printing at rates that we've never before and gobbling up. The Federal Reserve is going nuts. Interest rates are zero now, and therefore I'm curious as to what neoliberalism can do in order to solve this crisis. And it's not a coincidence, of course, that suddenly now we are hearing voices about people who like Kenneth Rogoff, who these are like the architects of austerity, saying that we need to expand the budget by $5 trillion, and that's the only way we're going to save the economy, things he never would have said 10 years ago. So in that sense, that's one of the reasons for my optimism, is that I just think that neoliberalism will not, and it's basically the Milton Friedman playbook, cannot save us from this crisis. And I think at some point, we're going to reach a point where capitalists are going to be more interested in sustaining the status quo, and also elites and politicians are going to be more interested in trying to save the status quo than they are from doing things as they've done before, and they will basically decide to go back to a more Keynesian tradition. Now, on the other hand, I'm fully aware that this Keynesianism can also be kind of an almost conservative reaction. So to give an example, I'm not particularly impressed by the fact that every amendment $1,000 or $1,200 this week or a few weeks ago. I don't see that as some giant shift towards universal basic income or anything like that. I really see that right now as that was a payment that I think was made mostly to bail out landlords. I think most of that money is basically probably just going to go to people who can't pay the rent, and that money is effectively going to go back to like the top 10% who own all the real estate assets. And we're worried because there was hearing voices that 40% of New Yorkers, for instance, weren't going to be able to pay their rent. So again, at this point, I'm still I'm not particularly impressed with like the policy ideas that I'm hearing, but nevertheless, I do think that the fact that monetary policy will not get us out of this, mixed with incredibly large, high rates of unemployment, I do definitely see a world where we could see some pretty massive shifts. And just to continue what Michael was saying, I agree with Michael, actually, that the comparison here at the end of the day, and what makes me optimistic in some ways, is not the New Deal, it's actually World War II. I think in many ways, some of the feelings, even the psychology that Michael was talking about, that really kind of created a huge shift in the American psyche that brought about really what were considered fairly good years of economic both growth and inequality in the 50s and 60s. I think first and foremost was this sense of insecurity that drove people away from the market and free choice and notions of freedom as being individualism. And really, the memory of World War II kind of pushed people into a new direction, one that was, as Roosevelt said it, freedom from fear and freedom from want and things like that. So I definitely could imagine a situation where this coronavirus kind of revitalizes these kind of other notions of freedom that really the market has no ability, I think, to answer them.
Yes, but everyone knows that the market itself.
Yeah, Michael.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You want to finish?
No, please.
Okay, you want to finish before I tell you that you got it wrong?
Go
Because
ahead,
no one, and no neoliberal even pretends that the market on its own, and you know this better than anyone, the capitalism uses the market when it suits its business models or its need for marginal profits, but the state is always the the last guarantor of stability, right? And we see this every few years, and once again we see it today. The capitalism, it was created by the state. It maintained, and it's been maintained ever since by activists. Stay active in one form or another, in one sphere or another. And when the crises occur, of course, the state becomes that much more involved and much more critical in again saving capital and saving the capitalists. We all remember that from 2008. I don't see anything changing now. Certainly not the steps being taken the past month or two are all along the same. The fact is that the Republican Party itself renounced or embraced deficit spending already with Trump's election. So I can't get too excited also by adding a few $1 trillion to the federal budget. That was something that was happening anyway. What's most important is, I think, however, is to make the distinction between the war that you mentioned, which was critical in the history of the American economy in the 20th century, and the construction of a viable, if moderate, welfare apparatus for most of the population as it developed in the 40s and 50s and through the 60s. And the war, and significantly enough, the rhetoric is prevalent that we're in a war today, a war against, but it's a fake war, excuse the expression. But it's all fiction. The war, we're not at war with, the virus cannot possibly, only perhaps Kafka can explain to us how the virus now, which no one knows how deadly the virus is anyway, because the statistics that they keep throwing around, all these numbers, are also meaningless and baseless. Of course, that's not such a new, statistics have always been biased and even used since they were invented at the end of the 18th century to help the state intervene on behalf of capital. But the statistics, the numbers being circulated today are unprecedentedly without any concrete anchor in reality. We don't know how many people are sick, though they tell us how many. We don't know how many people dying, what they're dying of, so we have absolutely no notion of the mortality rate. We don't have any idea if the mortality rate is greater than heart disease, it's less than a bad flu year, et cetera, et cetera. So why have we gone about now in destroying the economy and civil society? That's an important question. I don't really have an answer, but I see all around me everything working according to. I mean, this is an event that could only take place in an industrialized, capitalized, liberal or post, or almost nearing, or what we're inching to is not a post-capitalist reality. If we're looking to go beyond the status quo of today, we have to talk in terms of a post-liberal reality. The fact is that we're also, I mean, this quarantine, first of all, the quarantine is a form of class war. There's a rhetoric of the universal experience that we're all in it together. And of course, that's not true, because those who have been laid off from work, or those whose incomes have been affected, in other words, the effect, the outcome of the economic crisis matches or reflects the condition of the economy. The fact of the matter is also, there's been now 20 or 30 years of a vast pandemic in the United States called global capitalism, usually referred to euphemistically as the opioid crisis, right? But here's a pandemic of mass suicides, of now for 10 years, a consistent decrease in life expectancy among certain classes in the United States. This was a medical crisis that provoked none of this response. I have a feeling that if we want to start looking for the kinds of psychoses that I was referring to earlier, metaphorically, and not just metaphorically, it might be here. The desperation or the hopelessness. I wrote down, I looked at the front page of the New York Times one day last week, and I wrote down, so here's the lexicon of the crisis that's being used, this vocabulary to whip up docility, to keep us all at home, not being able to meet and do politics with each other. Our communications actually are now mediated by what? By technologies designed to serve corporate America, including this one. So what did the Times talk about? Hopelessness, of course, an explosion, an explosive situation, or an explosion of the pandemic, tragedy, disaster, catastrophe, Pearl Harbor, apropos of the Second World War, extreme social distress, and they weren't talking about unemployment and its ramifications. They're talking about our fears of getting sick, which somehow they've convinced us is synonymous with dying, which of course.
Michael.
Yeah, okay, you want to stop me here?
No, I have a question then. Given all of that.
They interviewed a cancer survivor in the New York Times that day, so we could understand what it's like to survive the coronavirus. Of course, apparently there are millions, if not tens of millions of Americans who have already survived the coronavirus, and they don't even know it, et cetera, et cetera.
Given all of that, given everything you're saying, and obviously the egregious.
So there's no second. So there's a war. It's a fiction. To what purpose? I don't.
All right, but
Except that there are people, apropos of the class war, there are people who have been at war now for decades, and they are the true victims. Some of which have died, and some of which are slowly experiencing social death.
But if that is the case, then why is it that cannot be translated into political change? Is it only because of I don't know, whatever? It could be the campaign finance system. It could be the way that money is integrated and to a certain account dominates American politics, or might it be something at the grassroots level? Might it be something in terms of culture? Because if everything that you suggest is true, and I tend to agree with some of it, then why can't, and why has that essentially never been translated into anything, even as you suggest in the New Deal itself, which of course never tried to do away with capitalism, not even to really restructure it, but really just very lightly manage and regulate it in a way to reinvent it, right? And it really, that what you call welfare capitalism or whatever, there's this fundamental malleability of capitalism, right? Almost Darwinian in its ability to kind of, right, to evolve and adapt itself to changing conditions. And do you, and this is, I guess, for Eli and then for Michael, do you see this happening now in a few months, maybe a few years? Capitalism emerges out of this even stronger? And I've been thinking a lot in the last few days. I read Joseph Schumpeter, right, the German economist, and this idea of creative destruction, right? And maybe this is the moment we're at where, right, where kind of capitalism reboots itself, but emerges even stronger, thus also reinscribing and reinforcing these inequalities that Michael justly has been kind of highlighting. Eli, please.
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, I think the part about the opioid epidemic was a great point. I mean, I think so. I mean, the life expectancy in the United States has been dropping the last few years for the first time since the Spanish flu, since around 1918. And I think well, you know, you'll see some articles about it. It was mostly ignored because it was working class people. And now too, most of the people who are going to die from the corona are working class. Just two things. I think that maybe we could argue about, we could question the reaction that governments have had to the coronavirus, but I wouldn't go as far as say it's fiction. I think one statistic that makes this plain is just how many people died in New York City in this month versus how many people died a year ago, and the numbers doubled. So twice as many people have died in the last month in New York City. And that, consider the fact that that's without anyone dying in car accidents and anyone dying, you know, from, you know, anything like that because they're not going outside. So in that sense, I just want to say, I mean, while I think it's a very interesting fact and not a given at all, that the reaction has been this complete shutdown. And I think it's really interesting to kind of interrogate why that happened. But I do think also that there are reasons for it. I also think that it's interesting in the United States, at least, just to kind of speak about kind of what I do think. I guess I'm playing the optimistic one here. What some of the things that this brings to light is also just, it's funny, but it brings back an old idea from the 19th century called the labor theory of value. And what I think has been most striking here is how pretty much everyone in the top 10% can go off to the Hamptons. We don't need them. We don't need any hedge fund workers. They don't do anything. All right. We don't need them. They play basically no role in the function of society. What we really need now are the bus drivers and the subway drivers and the people who clean the streets and the garbage collectors and the people who work at grocery stores. They're really, and so I think in maybe the most basic way possible, I do think that this crisis kind of will remind people of these kind of just, really basic ideas that do have a powerful, can have a powerful purchase on society. And that is this basic notion that, the market is not valuing people's labor as it should. And the people who really do the most in order to keep our society functioning are those receiving the least. And so I think that that's an important, and I do also think that it's important to note that at the end of the day, the numbers that we're seeing of deaths coming out of the United States is still much higher than we've seen in some other countries. Some of that has to do with the size of the population, but other, I think, has to do with a lot of issues that people have been talking about for many years. For instance, the fact that if you don't have paid sick leave, then you're going to go to work sick and you don't have a choice, and things like that kind of reflect. And then the last thing I want to say just about why I do think this can kind of lead to a certain destabilizing is the fact that one of the things that capitalism always tells us is that's really good, it's efficient, okay? You might, have to work more hours and you might get screwed by the boss, but at the end of the day, your physical well-being will be better. And I think one of the things that this crisis has revealed is just how, United States and in Israel, in some ways, it's very similar, the fact that nothing is manufactured in the United States anymore. And now you're really seeing, what effect that has. There aren't enough masks. There aren't enough ventilators. There aren't enough, and I think that's actually a very interesting kind of way of that you could see kind of like a critique of capitalism that even comes from, a producerist side of, we have to go back to, what's that famous quote? I think that Richard Gere says at the end of Pretty Woman, I'm going to go back to building things. That's the critique of private equity. So I could see kind of like a New Deal, because you mentioned that the New Deal didn't structurally change, except for one thing. The New Deal really did neuter Wall Street for about 30 years. For about 30 years, being on Wall Street wasn't very fun because of the New Deal. So I'm just throwing out ideas here, but I could see a way in which, maybe finance capitalism doesn't survive this crisis, or not survive, but maybe the bonuses and the high rates of inequality don't survive it as much as we thought. So I just wanted to mention those things. And then could you remind me again what your follow-up question was? Because
maybe just how does capitalism then emerge out of this crisis, right? If we're thinking about creative destruction, and we're already maybe seeing all of these jobs lost in hotel, restaurant, nightlife, bars, maybe they're now just going to transition to delivery, warehouse, stockholding, stuff like that.
Look, yeah. I think if we were in 1970s, I would say this is going to be a shock doctrine. We're going to get all these people to become contract workers. We're going to get all these people to be gig economy freelancers. But that's already happened. That's American neoliberalism in 2020. I mean, so I don't see how, they're going to now leverage this into really, I mean, obviously maybe in some areas, like for instance, the university system, I could see that certainly taking another hit. And, the Zoom University and Harvard and MIT's ideas of creating these giant for-profit platforms, I could definitely see that happening. But I think for most American workers, those huge structural changes that have left them, with absolutely no security, I think that's already happened. And so I'm not seeing how this, in that sense, that these kind of big structural changes could occur. I think in many ways they've already happened, and I think what this moment is revealing is just how no one has any basic security or any safety net in the United States if you're an Uber driver, or if you're a Lyft, or if you're one of these freelance workers like so many people are.
Michael, so who comes out of this stronger? Are there winners and losers, or is it the regular winners and losers, right?
China comes out of this stronger. Sorry.
All right.
I think globalization will now enjoy a strong push, a real impetus. I think a lot of the big, what's happening, so Eli, you talked about no one needs hedge fund workers. Well, we knew that actually already as well, but that didn't stop the economy from redistributing wealth so that they were enjoying an ever-growing piece of that pie. And then, of course, the Fed last week buys up several $100 billion worth of junk bonds, right?
I saw.
So I can think of only two reasons that they did that, and I don't know which one is worse. One is that, in fact, they've decided that this is an investor public, a risk-taking entrepreneurial public who are essential to the health of the economy. These are the people we want to encourage. Unlike the 30s, we want them to keep putting their capital into the system so that there won't be a Keynesian solution. It won't be a need, and so we're going to make sure that they know that they're one of the first publics that we're going to assist, even though they're one of the last publics that require assistance. Meanwhile, they're sending $1,200. It's chump change, of course, to tide people over until the trillions begin to trickle down again. The worst, or the other possibility, which is no better, is that there is a house of cards again. So we're in a 2007, 2008 situation where the models suggest that if the junk bonds collapse, it's all going to collapse. So I don't know which is worse, but in either event, it's clear now with the federal government's, what side the federal government is on, and they'll likewise identify important nodes in favored industries, and they'll send the monies there. Again, under the assumption that eventually these critical key industries are the motors also for employment. And so in one of these, and of course, high tech, which are now the largest monopolies in the American, apropos of the 1920s, monopolies, we should talk in terms of monopoly. 1920s, 1820s for that matter, and we're all now. They have this new rubric of a surveillance capitalism, which is based on the massive centrality and importance, in fact, of life that essentially cannot be an economy or a society that can no longer, or a way of life, what is still called a democratic way of life, that can no longer be managed without their technologies. And that, of course, is only further deepened. So I see a big capital is coming out, a big, not only American, but big global capital coming out. I would expect that there would be a serious discussion now of establishing some form of guaranteed income. That this will be eventually, this essentially will be a federal subsidy for the gig economy, to create a reserve army of labor who are always at call whenever we need to move people around the economy. But if the economy doesn't require them, it's easy then to shift them into the columns of the unemployed, because they won't starve. So this will be another form of, and by the way, I presume that they'll be giving that guaranteed income in the forms of loans, or maybe when you get a job, then it's turned back into a loan, so that you'll be paying a low interest loan, of course, but a loan nevertheless, so that the banks have more that they can then buy and sell as well. So I see what have become the essential foundations of the American economy of the past 30 years doing very well by this crisis. I don't mean to suggest they've initiated this crisis. I don't think anyone initiated this crisis. If anything, the crisis might be a desperate call for help by those who are most hurt by it. Globalization, there'll be some opposition within the Trump administration, of course. The Steve Bannon wing, who are anti-globalists and anti-China, but I would be very surprised, because so once you have a guaranteed income, then you don't need to reopen factories in the continental United States anymore either. That kind of empties the whole rationale of moving manufacturing jobs back into the United States. Because
So I want to, I have one question of my own, and then we'll take a few questions that I have quite a few emailed me, so I'll raise some of the questions because they do address globalization, and I think it's very apropos given just what you said. But first of all, just in terms of the, no, maybe we will take the question. Yeah, so we'll take the globalization question then, because it's interesting. You said that you suspect that actually global capital is going to benefit from this, right? But one of the theories that have come up, certainly just even foreign policy, I think just in the last few weeks, their latest issue was about, right, this provocative question of the end of globalization. Are we seeing the end of globalization? And then there's always the question, well, maybe this is an opportunity, especially given the fragility of the supply chains, and certainly the fact that Americans suddenly discovered that everything they consume isn't made in America anymore. Is this an opportunity to reclaim manufacturing? Part of it, maybe a new, I don't know, economic nationalism, or in that sense, we're not going to get rid of globalization. That's right, and everyone's who's talking about that's delusional. But we can change globalization, maybe. So maybe in that sense, there's an opportunity here. Eli?
Yeah. So first of all, I do think this crisis has shown how we still are very much in a world of nation states. The euro as a project has completely failed. Germany is only caring about Germans, and so I think in that sense, it's very clear that any kind of attempt to create some kind of transnational governance right now does not seem like it's working. For me, actually, I think the most interesting thing from the globalization side, other than the return of economic nationalism, which we know is already kind of, at least, a fake version of that was already being trumpeted around by the Trump establishment. But I do think that China's in a very unique position. I think what this crisis has shown is what nations have state capacity and what nations don't. And I think we've seen that, other than countries in the Far East like Japan and South Korea and China and Singapore, a lot of like Western European nations, you see just how kind of neoliberalism has hollowed out their ability to kind of take control of this crisis and stop the spread. Whereas there you've seen a lot more, and of course this also has to do with authoritarian regimes and otherwise, but still I do think that the big winner of this crisis is going to be China. And I think as far as I look at the future of capitalism in the United States, I think, and Michael rightfully noted how Trump is very comfortable with deficit spending. I think the real big kind of structural shift is going to occur when people are going to be questioning whether the dollar should remain a reserve currency of the world. And are we going to see at some point in the next few years this moment where this unlimited debt that Americans can take on would end because people are suddenly not interested in buying it because they're afraid that America is falling apart. So I think in that sense, when you see the number, just kind of like the failure of the United States compared to other nations to handle this crisis, and obviously they're in the lead now in the number of deaths and the number of people are getting sick and so forth, I think that could kind of, I think this was something that was coming in the 21st century anyway. I think the rise of China was probably in the long term going to happen anyway, but I think this could speed it up. And the other just thing I'll say, and this is actually a more pessimistic thing, is that I think until now, Trump, at least as I have seen it, has been a threat, but I think a fairly minor threat in the long scheme of things, because he was just the continuation of neoliberalism. The only thing Trump really did was cut taxes on rich people, and let's face it, he didn't invent that. That's something that's been going on for 40 years. I think the whole talk about panics that were nothing. I think the whole trade war was mostly bullshit. I think that was just him using these kind of tariffs to kind of perform this form of American power, but it was never going to go into a trade war because Trump doesn't really want, Walmart to have to raise its prices, because then all the poor people who vote for him would be screwed. But I do think that now that this crisis is upon us, what I do fear is a form of kind of right-wing, virulently racist economic populism that really does work in some ways. So, maybe Trump becomes addicted to the power that he gets from writing checks to every American, and he begins to become what, by the way, Steve Bannon always wanted him to become. And that was somebody who actually did raise taxes on the rich and take care of the bankers and, you know, kind of resort more to this kind of right-wing anti-finance kind of form of economic nationalism that was very effective, of course, in Europe in the 1930s. And to me, that's really what the scariest kind of end game is here.
Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, again, you know, in the 1920s and 1930s, the non-fascist states or the liberal states were utterly failed to address the crisis, the worldwide depression. Fascist states removed themselves, took themselves, in fact, out of the international system, and off the gold standard. Well, everyone got off the gold standard eventually, but it said that we're not playing by those rules anymore. We're going to play by our own rules. So in a way, perhaps maybe China. I'm going to try to follow up on Eli's lead. China is this post-liberal model of what capitalism can become, and my good friend Roy Kreitner had me read Wolfgang Strick's article on the end of capitalism, where we always thought, well, that something better must be around the corner, but of course Strick explains that no, actually, it's going to be far worse. And so China would be far worse. In saying the examples you took from the Far East are all societies that are distinctly illiberal or less liberal than Western industrial states, and that might be what's happening. Certainly, the CDC has put into place an apparatus, was proven to be surprisingly effective and efficient apparatus for suspending freedoms of the population in total, the entire population. So so pandemics, because there's diseases all the time. Capitalism, by the way, has always been, I mean, you know, cholera in the 19th century, you can imagine what they would have done with cholera if they had been as hysterical as we are today. So disease is a permanent aspect of the history of capitalism. And so it's waiting now. We have the apparatus in place for moving towards an authoritarian kind of China model, no doubt. And now, of course, without trade unions, I can't emphasize, I think, because this is earlier a question, a very important question you raised that we didn't really address, and that is, how do you do politics now? What kind of politics is possible, or alternative politics, or a politics that offers an alternative vision? It's very difficult to do politics when you're alone, and this economy has made everyone alone. Even before it locked us in. What is it called in the English? A lockdown? Even is that the term? Lockdown. Which is like prison vernacular, right? And so without trade unions, you know, the New Deal regime of the 40s and 50s and 60s was based on a sense that was based on kind of a meta market model where negotiations would go on between corporate bodies that more or less had kind of a mad relationship with each other, mutual assured destruction. They had to make a deal because each of them was too powerful, right? That doesn't exist anymore. They have nothing like that. So the only hope, the only optimism I can offer is to hope that Sanders is going to use his very real threat. And this is real, unlike the war against the coronavirus, because at least Democrats are under the impression, I don't know if it's true or not, that he denied Hillary a victory 4 years ago. Whether it's true or not, it's very good that the rank and file of the Democratic Party believe that is indeed what happened, because that will, of course, only enhance his negotiating stance now with Biden and the rest of the Obama, Clinton, reactionaries or neoliberals within the Democratic Party, so he can force their hand. Otherwise, I don't see much changing.
So I wanted to take the opportunity because I want to bundle together a few questions that we received about moving forward, what happens next, especially in the democratic aspect. So I'll bundle together 3 questions I received into a final question to you guys, and you could also use it for your conclusion remarks as we wrap things up. In terms of Michael, you mentioned I don't want to use the word compromise. You mentioned making a deal. You mentioned guaranteed income, right? And this is something, a guaranteed income by the federal government, something that certainly has, since especially in the 60s, the late 60s, early 70s, people like Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was championing this, and it always came with a price, right? Now, would you find it feasible, and maybe just even in terms of your own politics, if this is the price, right? We started with Sanders, let's conclude with Biden, who is going to be the Democratic nominee. If this is the what he comes to, right, in terms of negotiating, if he is elected, right, in terms of getting some kind of universal health care, getting some kind of guaranteed income, especially to those at the bottom of the ladder, the gig economy, the people suffering most now, if that comes at a price of bailing out the airlines, of sustaining neoliberalism, but regulating it a bit more, but controlling it a bit more, is that one politically feasible way that we could see some kind of progress, some kind of optimism moving forward out of the virus?
No, I don't think so. I think a guaranteed income would matches the general kind of liberal program of today. There's no challenge here. Quite the opposite. It strikes me as a recipe for political, not to mention economic passivity. The last thing people with guaranteed incomes are going to do is organize collectively. In fact, they might not be allowed. This might be an opportunity to turn that kind of atomization into a permanent situation. A guaranteed income, of course, is very controversial, both not only on the right, but no less so on the left, and for
Sure.
good reason. So no, I don't see that. I think I would expect the neoliberals now will begin to push a guaranteed income form of solution of one kind or another, because it was on the way. And I forgot about Moynihan, who was, of course, not a neoliberal, but a neoconservative, but there might not be much difference. That's something we can think about. Yeah.
Right.
So no, I'm afraid that there's no light at the end of that tunnel either.
Eli.
I think when you look at the politics right now, we're in a very interesting moment, because I think my instincts in many ways as a voter are to now hold my nose and vote for Biden, because I think, he's still better than Trump. But I don't think you can deny the fact that the best thing for the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party is for Trump to win the presidency. And the reason I say that is because I think the number one reason why Bernie Sanders lost to Biden was because of the electability argument. If you look at polls, most Americans want Medicare for all. Most Americans want, these higher taxes on the rich people. But they were convinced by the powers that be, whoever, that Bernie had no chance against Trump, which I actually think Bernie had a much higher chance against Trump than he did within the Democratic Party. That was the real challenge, because the Democratic Party, of course, is mostly a party of upper middle class suburbanites, and very hard in many ways for Bernie to beat them.
And the stock market.
And we can also talk about the 401k politics. 50% of Americans who are in the stock market and don't want it to go down. A very different structural change that's happened in the last 40 years that didn't exist, by the way, during the New Deal. When the stock market dropped, 80% of Americans be like, yeah, let it burn. And that's not the case anymore, because our future is in the stock market. But I just want to say that I think in the long run, I think in many ways, because the anti-left argument within the Democratic Party was so incredibly not on anything but the electability. That was really all they hung their hats on. The entire Biden campaign is only built on that. He has basically no other stand. Then I do think, without a doubt, you could imagine a 2024 with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez running for president, where those arguments would no longer work. I mean, Hillary loses to Trump once, Biden loses to Trump again. And so I think we're in a very difficult situation here, because, again, this talks to like the short term, long term, which is what I began my talk with. And I think these things are, in conflict. They're always in conflict in history. If you want to kind of improve people's lives now, make them, marginally better, which is incredibly important. And I'll remind you, Sanders, in the end, supported the stimulus package 2 weeks ago, which half of it was basically bailouts that Steve Mnuchin is going to decide who gets the money. And in the end, Bernie, I think, proved in many ways what I always thought of Bernie Sanders, and I love him, but that is that he's a New Deal liberal more than he was, any form of radical socialist. So in that sense, I think the politics here are very interesting, because I think the only way you're going to get long-term change is if you get even more short-term suffering. But, who am I as a privileged upper middle class white person to now say that that's what Americans need to do? I mean, my God, the people who are going to really feel the brunt of the pain in that regard are, of course, going to be the weakest and the poorest and the brownest and the blackest people in America. So I think it's a real conundrum as far as, like, where do you go from here as far as the politics go. And I definitely think that at the end of the day, Sanders is going to have to really have his, I'm going to say come to Jesus moment, but I guess that doesn't work with Bernie. But he's going to have to decide, is he going to endorse Joe Biden and, hopefully get some promises of, I'll have to tell you, my best case scenario would be maybe a public option. Okay, you're not going to get Medicare for all, maybe a public option, which would be huge for a lot of Americans.
Yeah.
But
until the court strikes it down.
Well, that's interesting. That's a good point. Although it's interesting that they didn't strike down Obamacare, but that's a very interesting point. But
that might be the deal, Michael. That might be the deal. Right, because Republicans, I mean, look who was pitching the $1,200, right? I mean, it was Mitt Romney, right? The guy who coined the phrase, corporations are people, my friend, right? If you, the guy from Bain Capital, if you have all these neoliberals moving out of their own self-interest because they understand they're not going to be able to.
Exactly, there's no contradiction whatsoever, and guaranteed income does not contradict neoliberal its understanding of how the economy needs to work. Quite the opposite. They've never hesitated in reining in the state in order to prop up what are essentially profit margins that are so risky, they implode every few years. So this is the crisis economy we know. By the way, capitalism, of course, is apropos of Schumpeter. Trotsky got it all wrong, right? The form of modern permanent revolution is capitalism, not Bolshevism. And it's constantly destroying itself in order to reinvent itself. And I just want to say one other thing about what we know after 200 or 250 years of rather intense experience of capitalist organizing the economy and society around the logic of capital and the logic of profit, and there was never, at least not since Alexander Hamilton or after Hamilton got shot, a vision of capitalism that did not include globalization. There was always there was never, capital could never have acquired the centrality and the power and the efficiency and the profitability that it did, and the political allegiance that it did from elites, and not just from elites, without a global system, without it working within a global system, creating a global system. That's why Marx and Engels begin the Communist Manifesto exactly with that point. So, apropos of globalization, I can't, that would be the end of capitalism, but I think what we're facing, the real threat is the end of a liberalism, and for socialists, the situation is so desperate that we find ourselves now having to defend all the liberal tenets which we otherwise recognize as to have led us all astray, away from the early promise of equality and freedom for all.
All right. So on that less than optimistic note, I think we will conclude. I know I didn't get to all the questions. I'm sorry. We had over a dozen questions. I tried to get to as many as I got. I want to thank, first of all, Michael and Eli, right, for a terrific conversation. I think lots of food for thought. And I want to thank the nearly 50 people who I saw just on our social media come together and listen and view us. This is being recorded. You can see it on our YouTube page, which is on Tau video website. And this is the first of many, right? This is the beginning of our conversation. It's certainly not the end of it. We're going to have this every few weeks. We're going to have a different panel, certainly moving forward toward the election in November. And so we'll meet here again with some of these guests and new ones as well. And I want to thank everyone in Israel, in the US, abroad, and stay safe and have a wonderful Passover, and be healthy. And thank you.